Night settles over the Nile with the softness of black silk, and the breath of the river moves like a memory through reeds that have whispered to countless dynasties, as if even the landscape remembers what the stone refuses to say. The constellations rise as they once did for the astronomer priests, who calculated their long cycles with a patience made of centuries, eyes trained on patterns that never forgot to return. In that hushed geometry of moonlight and masonry, the temples do not look old so much as paused, as though their meaning is waiting for someone to ask the right question in the right tone, and only then will the night lean closer to answer. The phrase forbidden science drifts through this silence, like a scent of incense that never quite reveals its source, implying not a modern laboratory, but a web of guarded practices that bound mathematics to myth and observation to ritual. The word was Heka, power made articulate, the tuning of breath and symbol and substance, so the world would remember its proper shape. Within the house of life, that cloistered repository attached to major temples, scribes copied recipes and rites with hands trained to see more than ink, and what they preserved was less a text than a map with many hidden doors. Light from oil lamps once glowed over palettes of soot and ochre, as young copyists learned the geometry of healing, guided by elders who counted pulses while reciting invocations, taking the measure of fever, beneath a logic that asked both the body and the gods to yield. The Edwin Smith Papyrus records triage, fracture management, sutures, and prognoses that ring clinical even now, while the ancient word for heart traveled the vessels and carried a cosmos within its beat. The way a surgeon priest moved through a case suggests a discipline that expected the unseen to obey pattern, which begs the question of what else in that world was observed so intently that it began to respond. A different set of sheets, the Ebers Papyrus, reads like an apothecary of the Nile's long memory, cataloging honey, resin, willow, and copper salts with claims that modern tests only grudgingly demystify. Honey's antiseptic grip, the mild analgesia of certain barks, the antimicrobial spark of blue-green minerals swirling into pastes, all wrapped in chants that were no less precise for being poetic. If cure and charm were braided into a single cord, it was because both were considered instruments, and instruments demand tuning, a principle that turns back towards stone and sky with its unspoken symmetry. To stand at Giza at dawn is to feel a precision that survived in granite long after the names were dust, with the Great Pyramid squared to true north with a delicacy that still embarrasses careless compasses. The minute error suggests a method more refined than folktale, perhaps a circle and a shadow measured over seasons, perhaps stellar alignments calculated against the slow drift of procession that unspools across lifetimes. When accuracy persists beyond the scale of a human career, purpose takes on the dimension of ritual, and ritual, when exact, begins to read like an equation written in horizon and light. At the heart of this stone geometry, sound behaves like a disciplined animal, pooling and prowling in chambers that reward certain frequencies, the way a harp rewards a practiced hand. The king's chamber hums under low tones, setting the ribs of granite to a murmur that feels architectural and biological at once, as though the building were coaxing a response from within its own crystal lattice. If resonance was known not merely as music, but as leverage, then what else did vibration suggest to those who carved rooms that sing back when called? In corridors where the air is cooler than logic, subtle damage to beams and floors hints at forces beyond simple weight, cracks that whisper of movement, pressure, release, and engineering that understands stress, like an astrologer understands intervals. Not all voices are ones we can hear. Some are the measured size of materials under cyclic load, like bellows worked slowly through generations. If tone and mass were coupled in ritual, then the boundary between ceremony and experiment narrows into a seam of possibility that might have been guarded as priestly prerogative. Far from Giza, in the crypts of Dendra, reliefs curl through stone like tightly coiled riddles, lotus opening to emit serpents within bulb-like ovals, while pillars crowned as Jed stand like batteries of continuity in a language of images that does not care what we call it. Mainstream readings speak of creation and perfume, of myth hardened into symbol, yet the reliefs keep their playful ambiguity, because the room that holds them bears suitless ceilings and secretive architecture that favors those who knew how to stage phenomena. A rite can seem like technology from the outside, and technology can appear like magic when it is choreographed in the dark. Then there is Egyptian blue, a pigment the color of deep water and dream, produced by grinding silica, lime, and copper compounds and heating them to yield a crystalline tapestry that, under invisible wavelengths, glows with a cool, uncanny light. This luminescence answers a spectrum outside our eye's ordinary kingdom, casting a quiet radiance under infrared that makes reliefs whisper under modern probes. And the ancient craftsmen did not need to name it to exploit its allure. The knowledge to make such color suggests a chemistry as ritualized as any hymn, and a willingness to work at the edge of what fire and mineral will allow. Within the walls of the House of Life, papyrus rolled into scrolls like sleeping snakes, each coil labeled with headings that concealed as much as they revealed, each column a threading of syllables that were both instruction and invocation. Scribes practiced discretion as craft, folding recipes into metaphors, listing ingredients by epithets, and reserving certain words for initiated ears, because power distributed without context had a way of escaping its purpose. If some knowledge was withheld, it may be less that it was dangerous, and more that it was tuned to a network of rooms, rites, and times that had to be in place to make sense. And still, the desert keeps its own index, a catalog not of texts, but of techniques, carved into decisions. Choice of quarry, angle of cut, bedding orientation of blocks, and mortar that bite and endure with a grip that feels almost biological. To read a wall the way a scribe reads a page is to understand how much can be stored in choice and joint, in silence and seam. If we listen closely to the stone, the next phase of the story begins to form, and its first syllables have the rhythm of chisel and sand, of sound coaxed from rock, as if the mountain itself were an instrument waiting to be played. In the high heat of Aswan, where granite blooms from the earth like a sleeping animal, the unfinished obelisk lies fused to its bed, a monument more eloquent in failure than many successes, telling us in stubborn bulk how carving was a negotiation with stress, rather than an act of brute removal. Grooves run along its sides like measured breaths. Bowl-shaped pits mark where pounding stones struck in rhythms we can still count. And hairline cracks record the day the rock refused to plan with a subtlety that only masters would notice in time. Standing there, one senses a method designed for listening, as if the stone signaled its limits before the artisans risked a final cut. Across the Nile's deep history, the quarries teach in textures, their walls striated by saws and chisels, whose marks unfold into data whenever light strikes at the right angle, revealing curves and patterns that betray the tool's teeth and the pressure of the hands. In diorite and granite, circular drill holes ringed by spiral striations suggest tubular tools guided by abrasives, perhaps copper and sand in an embrace that chewed slowly, sometimes with speeds argued over by those who read grooves as language. The question that lingers in these lines is not whether copper can bite stone, but how predictably it could do so, and what apprentices were taught to sense in the sound and slur of slurry. At Saqqara, deep within the Serapeum, black granite sarcophagi sit with the poise of equations solved in 3 dimensions, their interiors polished to a quiet that refuses to be accidental, their corners trued to angles that do not forgive fatigue. The lids weigh many tons and yet settle on their boxes with a confidence that implies tight tolerances, a vocabulary of flatness and plane and fit that belongs as much to precision craft as to funerary devotion. Here, the mystery is not the why, but the how across multiple instances, and the answer may lie in a workshop tradition that encoded measurement in ritual so thoroughly we forget it was measurement. Within pyramids and passageways, acoustics do not merely decorate space, they structure it, coaxing whispers into bloom and swallowing shouts in a way that suggests a mastery of geometric response, deliberate as a musician choosing a room. The sarcophagus in one chamber hums when a note in the right range is sustained, and certain galleries amplify footsteps into slow thunder that vibrates in bone more than ear, a phenomenon unnerving only if we assume it was unintended. When landscapes of stone respond to tone, the line between ceremony and calibration dissolves, and we are left to wonder what rituals were timed by sound and what measurements were disguised as hymns. Out on the desert, wind is the oldest musician, and ancient architects learned to either quiet its voice or let it sing through vents that behave like flutes, scaling the facades of temples and tombs, smoothing turbulence to gentle breath or focusing it into a murmur that travels. A vent that carries sound can also carry scent, smoke, and temperature, turning stone into a stabilizer of climate, a technology of comfort that leaves no inscription, but the contentment of those who dwelt within. If the ancient mind counted air among the sacred elements, that reverence became practice, and practice became architecture that still behaves like a living machine when the wind cooperates. Time, too, obeyed their instruments, captured in shadow, migrating across carefully scribed markers, manifest in the predictable rise of water inside limestone cylinders that sniffed the Nile's mood better than any court ruler. Nilometers did more than measure flood. They predicted grain and tax, tethering cosmic cycles to daily bread, with a logic so practical it might be called secular were it not wrapped in ritual. A ruler who knows the river's intent months in advance enjoys a kind of power that requires no miracle. And it is here that forbidden science earns another shade of meaning, as knowledge withheld becomes currency. In the workshops, metal hammers sing in registers that shift as blades anneal and work harden, copper blooms alloyed into bronze in later eras, and meteoritic iron, heaven's rare gift, files into ceremonial edges that glow with meaning even when their utility is limited. The adze used to open the mouth of a statue or a mummy carried iron as a symbol of the sky's own bones, a union of metallurgy and myth that perfectly expresses how technique was braided to theology. To shape a tool from a fallen star is to admit that the world arrives with instructions if we learn to read them. And if we read well, we might also learn to hide. Glass and faience, ceramics and frit, all these speak of furnaces where temperature was measured by color and sound. The hiss and hue of fire becoming gauges more sensitive than number, for artisans trained to trust senses, sharpened by repetition. Egyptian blue required consistent heat and careful batching, a manufacturing that implies standardized vessels and timing, perhaps set to chance that meter out seconds the way a heart measures life. A ritual that sets the pace for a kill can be a timer in disguise, and so a hymn becomes a clock without numerals, ticking in breath and beat while the flames do their quiet algebra. Mortar between megalithic blocks reveal compositions tailored to endurance. Gypsum and lime and silicates blended into pastes that cure with a tenacity as rational as any modern binder, yet folded into a language of offerings to deities of earth and craft. Ancient masons did not leave behind step-by-step manuals, but they embedded recipes into temple economies, ensuring ingredients flowed along sacred routes, ensuring knowledge remained anchored to places and people who guarded their roles. If we seek the forbiddens, it may be hiding in accounting, in grain for natron, in incense for resin, in tallies that map to chemistry under names that only insiders would understand. The deeper one goes into the rock-cut corridors, the more the conversation shifts from what is carved to what is tuned, to the idea that chambers are experiments made permanent, designed to run on air, voice, and patient time. The Great Pyramid's narrow shafts align toward stars, once bright in ritual calculus. But they also behave like waveguides for air, and perhaps even for the human need to connect breath with cosmic order. A conduit so literal and symbolic that to pick one reading over the other feels like a failure of imagination. When an interpretation allows two truths to coexist, secrecy becomes less about hiding and more about guarding complexity from flattening. Not all techniques were benign in their social effect. For knowledge asymmetry is a comfortable throne, and priesthoods have always understood how to soften the blow of mystery by offering structured revelation while keeping certain keys within their own temple vaults. The withheld may have included methods to time floods, to preserve bodies, to stage light and sound in ways that suggested divine approval, to make stone show deference through phenomena rehearsed to perfection. What matters next is how light itself entered the script beyond flame, and which pigments and minerals were recruited to perform under conditions designed to seem miraculous in the eyes of those who did not know the cues. When the cryptid Dendera is imagined not as a stage of speculation, but as a laboratory of perception, the serpent in the bulb becomes a wave, the jed a stabilizer, the lotus a trigger, a metaphorical diagram of forces that lift and oscillate in both ritual and physics. If a procession carried reflective metals, oils, and translucent vessels through planned darkness, then a whisper of luminescence could animate stone as if breath had crossed it, and the crowd would receive transformation while the initiates fine-tuned the unseen levers. That possibility leads us toward pigments that hold and release light like secret keepers, and toward a chemistry of radiance older than our words for it. Long before formulas wore the grammar of algebra, the temple treasury included powders that behaved like captured moments of sunrise, substances ground and sifted until their crystal habits were as familiar as the hieroglyphs on the walls. Egyptian blue is the exemplar, its copper calcium silicate lattice responding eagerly to invisible wavelengths, fluorescing with a calm that outlives empires and responds today to the probing rays of researchers who coax gentle glow from ancient fragments. To craft such pigment required not only suitable minerals, but control over heat and atmospheric conditions within furnaces that breathed carefully managed drafts, a choreography of fire the priests would never call anything less than sacred. Faience beads gleam with the skin of a sky condensed to glaze, silica-rich pastes self-glazing as they fired, sweating glass to the surface in response to alkalis inside the mix, a controlled exudation that leaves ordinaries enchanted. The phenomenon is chemistry wearing a veil, and the veil was placed on purpose, because to own the recipe is to own a method of turning mundane powder into durable color. And durability is power when scarcity rules. In the House of Life, such recipes may have been inscribed as hymns to Hathor or Thoth, hiding the ratio of ash to sand within a cadence only an initiate would recognize. Elsewhere on the desert's bright table, chunks of pale green glass lie fused into puddles of eternity at the edges of ancient craters, formed by heat so wild that sand surrendered all structure to become tektite-like sheets, known now as desert glass. Egyptians lifted these pieces as if they were stray fragments of the sun, and carved them into ornaments and ritual objects, their surfaces carrying the sweet paradox of stone that was once liquid fast enough to be unthinkable. To hold such an object near the breastbone is to wear a story about fire from the sky, and that story becomes a lens through which knowledge of heat and transformation is held and guarded. Mummification stands at the crossroads of chemistry and theology, a recipe for immortality written in resins and salts, in natron that persuades water to leave, and in oils that bend decay's appetite toward indifference. Studies of these mixtures find pine resins from far lands, bitumen that anchors scent with gravity, cassia and cedar and pistachia, blended into balms that perform like early biomedical protections against microbes, executed across centuries with skill that improves in concentrates. The embalmers did not publish, they performed, and their workshops must have smelled of earth and spice and controlled putrefaction, a place where the forbiddance was not dark, but carefully managed. The suspicion that electricity lit the crypts is a modern fancy eager for drama, yet the ancient experiments with light were subtler and perhaps more enduring, achieved through polished copper or gold, and through arrangements that dress darkness with shine and glow. Luminous calcite, gypsum crystals, copper mirrors, aligned to chase a sunbeam down corridors, resin-soaked wicks tuned to burn clean, and blue pigments that respond to wavelengths outside mundane vision. All these could convince a heart primed by ritual that walls could wake. To stage phenomena that exceed ordinary experience is to set thresholds and guard them, not to deceive for its own sake, but to bind a community to the sanctuary's rhythm. Astronomy, meanwhile, was the longest-running study, and their observations of Sirius, the herald of the flood, resulted in a calendar that found its anchor in a period so precise that only patience could find it, the Sothic cycle stretching nearly a millennium and a half into a dataset. Decans marched across the night in 10-day groups that regulated the stars' clockwork, used to divide hours and watch the night, creating a matrix where time aligned with liturgy, harvest, and the pulse of ritual. When timekeeping is embedded in myth, the myth becomes a device that compels continuity, a machine made of narrative that never quite stops. The idea that a secret physics sat behind the star shafts of the Great Pyramid captures the modern appetite for elegant mechanisms. Yet the older appetite was for order made visible, for a geometry that guaranteed emanation from heaven to earth without leaks. Alignments to Orion and Sirius are not accidents, but statements of relationship, connecting the pharaoh's fate to cycles that outlive 1,000 lives, anchoring kingship in recurrence, too grand to fake. The shafts become both breath and vector, at once practical and symbolic, and in their dual service, the forbiddance hides in plain sight as a technique for bending fear into confidence. Metal glints in this story whenever ritual demands edge or sparkle, but not all metal fell from heaven. Much was coaxed from earth with furnaces, whose behavior had to be learned by listening rather than measuring, by watching for the dance of oxidation and reduction on a blade's surface. The earliest iron in Egypt bears the nickel of meteors, a fingerprint of sky, and its use in sacred tools transmuted unfamiliar hardness into a theology of stars made tactile. The knowledge to recognize a fragment of meteorite and to work it into a ceremonial adze is not forbidden so much as rare, and rarity is the seed of exclusivity. Underneath these arts lies the philosophy that words and things do not merely correspond, but participate. That naming is not a label, but an activation. That a spoken formula is a switch as much as an invocation, as real in effect as a manual gesture. Heka is not a trick. It is an architecture where breath, ink, and material align to push the world into a pattern it prefers to maintain once set. A cybernetics of offering and feedback that modern understanding can barely translate. If the priests hoarded anything, it was this interface, the protocols for addressing nature in a tone that makes it listen. The dream of a secret library that held deeper protocols than any we have found persists because fragments surface in tombs and caches that feel like footnotes to volumes we know were once whole. References to the Book of Thoth that promised knowledge at a cost. The House of Life was both archive and clinic, both school and sanctuary. And the way texts were cited suggests a hierarchy of access. Layers of commentary wrapped around core practices like the nesting of shrines within a temple. Where are the kernels, the unadorned instructions for turning blue into radiance and stone into sound, and who accepted the burden of memory when ink was too risky to trust? In the cool shade of capital and hypostyle, painters rendered gods with the confidence of technicians who knew their pigments would last if kept from wind and rain. And many of those surfaces still speak in colors that transmit across 3,000 years. When the shade lifts and noon rides the colonnades, one can imagine how certain reliefs glimmered under discrete angles, how glazes released their inner glow as the sun progressed, turning the day itself into a ritual instrument. Somewhere in that long choreographing of light is the transition to the library that would gather such arts under a single city's ambition, offering an amplitude of learning that could amplify secrets or dissolve them. The legend threads through dynasties that a Book of Thoth once existed, not a volume as we bind them, but a sequence of tablets and recitations that remade the reader by degrees, until nature answered with docility. A narrative that explains why initiation was never casual. To be trusted with words, that act is to be made responsible for outcomes you cannot fully foresee. And so degrees of secrecy were not merely power plays, but restraints, brakes on engines that could overspeed in unpracticed hands. The priests of Heliopolis and Thebes guarded such progressions by embedding each step in rite and architecture, requiring the body to learn what the mind wished to skip. One guardian figure is Kamwasit, a prince and high priest who loved to restore old tombs, reading names back into existence and reviving memory through preservation. A conservator who understood that erasure is the enemy of continuity. His work hints that even in antiquity, the past was already ancient, and that curatorship was a kind of science, a management of time and material that sought to keep instructions legible for futures he could not imagine. When a culture performs restoration, it admits that its own loved methods can slip away, which means there are always things that might be lost more easily than stone. And then there is Imhotep, architect, physician, and scribe, his memory telescoped into divinity long after his life, a signal that he represented a fusion of crafts so useful it had to be mythologized. The step pyramid at Saqqara stands as his signature, a stacking of mastabas into a stair of ambition, a structure that reorganized burial into monument, and created a new canvas for aligning power with precision. Around such figures accumulates rumor of encyclopedic knowledge, some of it earned and some projected. And in that halo, we glimpse the way science has become forbidden by virtue of association with the rare and the irreplaceable. When the Library of Alexandria rose under Ptolemaic hands, grafted onto older Egyptian traditions and Greek appetite, it promised a new arrangement. Knowledge centralized, catalogued, made comparative, and perhaps democratized for those who could reach its halls. Ships offloaded their scrolls to be copied. Texts on medicine, mechanics, astronomy, and theology. A flood of information that asked hard questions about who now controlled what was once tissued into temple privilege. The Serapeum, a sister sanctuary, held its own collections in schools, leaving us to wonder if the fusion of Greek inquiry with Egyptian ritual disciplines produced syntheses that only flicker in later Hermetic texts. Hermes Trismegistus appears in late echoes as a composite of Thoth and Mercury, a fictional sage speaking aphorisms about as above, so below, and the Emerald Tablet compresses cosmology into a few lines that behave like a prism for interpretive light. The Hermetic tradition claims descent from temple lore, translated into Greek and Latin, reshuffled in alchemical allegory, obscured not to hide from the unworthy, but to force the reader to become worthy through a kind of intellectual posture. If any forbidden science survived collapse, it may be through this tradition of purposeful opacity, a strategy that lets a message cross burning libraries by disguising itself as paradox. In a more literal register, instruments for measuring time and flow evolved into increasingly reliable machines, clepsydras calibrated with notches and inscriptions, water clocks that taught the night watchman exactly when to strike the gong. The Nilometer's data became administration, which became mathematics, which became architecture, and in the laboratory of empire, the feedback loop tightened until prediction felt like enchantment because it eliminated surprise. To translate a star's return into grain store management is to convert a myth into bread, and perhaps nothing is more subversive than feeding the populace on schedule without appealing to thunder. The labyrinth of Hawara, described by ancient visitors as a dizzying complex of chambers and courts, haunts the imagination because it refuses to be easily found in modern clarity, existing in fragments and rolls rather than as a single living plan. Some suggest it was part administrative building, part mortuary machine, part demonstration of power through navigational challenge, a space that trained its visitors to move according to someone else's rules. A building that compels behavior is a form of technology, and if instructions were embedded in walls rather than texts, then the Forbiddens is not a book, but a building you cannot quite read. The crocodile mummies of the Fayum cradle papyri stuffed as padding, recycled texts used to pack the dead as if truth could be repurposed into silence, and these scraps sometimes preserve treatises long lost in their original form. That repurposing is a grim grace, preserving learning precisely because it was demoted to wrapping, a paradox that turns waste into archive. And in those fibers we find medical notes, contracts, astronomical records, and hints at routines thicker than any myth. Knowledge is stubborn, and its survival strategies are broadcast by accidents, suggesting other caches that might still be sealed by chance and ceremony. Conquerors came and went, folding Egypt into empires that had their own priorities, and with each shift, temples lost monopoly, as monasteries and courts took their turns at guarding and diluting the precious blend of rite and measurement. Fragments of practices persisted underground, as recipes preserved in family workshops, as incantations in demonic scripts, as diagrams that look like decorations, until a trained eye recognizes schematic simplicity. The forbiddance, under pressure, becomes vernacular, and the vernacular hides more easily, which might explain why certain techniques resurface centuries later as if newly invented. Even the desert's edges tell of continuities with places beyond the horizon, trade routes that carried incense and lapis, resins and news, returning not only with goods, but with stories of techniques tried elsewhere, seeds for new hybrids. In this exchange, secrecy loses its borders, and the House of Life becomes one node in a network that prefigures universities and workshops spread across seas, where a guarded practice could be decoded by a different tradition's curiosity. If a mystery could travel, it did so in the hands of craftsmen, not the mouths of philosophers, which hints at where to look next for residues of practice that never wrote themselves down. Maps, both literal and speculative, still circulate among those who dream of hidden libraries beneath silt and stone, of workshops sealed and perfumed with the dust of long-closed doors, of a place where instructions were drawn rather than declared. The thought persists because the experience of certain spaces in Egypt still feels like entering a diagram, an engineered state that acts on senses with more than architecture, nudging breath and attention in ways that teach without confession. Somewhere in that feeling lies a path toward modern rediscovery, a path that begins with measuring what ancient runes still do to us when we enter them with instruments open and assumptions muted. Modern tools have begun to listen to Egypt with a patience comparable to priestly devotion, and they are hearing signals that line up with old claims in ways both affirming and unsettling. CT scans of mummies reveal dental work and prosthetics that barely dent the myth of ancient crudity, instead pointing to pragmatic problem-solving that humanizes ritual by tying it to daily pain. Chemical analyses of embalming resins show mixtures optimized for antimicrobial and aromatic properties, a recipe refined over centuries without recourse to jargon, making laboratories into time machines that return craftsmanship to the status of experiment. In the galleries of museums, shards of Egyptian blue spark under infrared lamps like bottled twilight, their fluorescence so reliable that conservators use it to map original paint, while physicists imagine applications in security inks and biomedical imaging. The Pigments' resilience is a letter from antiquity that we can still read, a portable demonstration of an effect the ancients exploited without quantifying, a bridge from their furnace to our waveguides. When a color behaves like a device, the barrier between art and engineering thins, and we are invited to reconsider temple workshops as research complexes with incense. Acoustic surveys inside pyramids and tombs translate space into frequency plots, showing peaks and valleys where voices once swelled and died, a cartography that suggests certain chambers were tuned intentionally to amplify low chants and subdue high cries. Engineers with laptops now hear what barefoot priests already knew by feel, that resonance is a lever, even when it holds nothing but air, that a room can teach breath to move a specific way. The rediscovered acoustics do not unmask secrets so much as validate them, encouraging a search for functions hidden in sensoria rather than in overt devices. Outside, satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar sketch outlines of buried walls and streets, like ghost towns surfacing at dusk, revealing the scale of urban planning that once organized daily life around sacred calendars. Infrastructure from harbors to workshops emerges as grids and curves under sand, hinting at precincts where controlled heat, chemical storage, and standardized production might have cohabited under the watch of scribes who kept counts under the eyes of gods. If industry sat within ritual precincts, then the formula for controlling access was architectural. And that formula still writes itself in the ground when we learn to read from a height. Meteorite iron objects tell their own story under handheld spectrometers, their nickel content betraying their origin, and their polishing marks hinting at techniques practiced with patience rather than force, transforming the sky's refuse into tokens of the heavens' social contract with Earth. The adze used in the opening of the mouth-rite speaks of contact as technology, not only between tool and stone or flesh, but between narrative and community, with the object, the action, and the story coalescing into a single protocol. Every test result folds another layer of the ritual back into technique, and in that folding, the forbiddance begins to look like well-placed emphasis rather than malice. The star shafts puzzle from many angles, their diameters, bends, and terminals charted with lasers, their alignments matched ancient skies with software that rolls back precession like a music score played in reverse, showing Orion's belt and Sirius where the builders saw them. Those who argue for ventilation find too little throughput. Those who argue for sky souls find enough precision to affirm intention. And both positions may be correct if the shafts are vectors of meaning that needed only a symbolic breath to function. In either case, the builders had to calculate across time and stone with confidence, training a sightline through rock to intersect a constellation's promise. In workrooms and museums, residues clinging to jars and mixing vessels give up secrets slowly under gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, revealing plant resins, animal fats, and mineral traces that reconstruct recipes kept as temple economies rather than texts. When a jar says cedar and terebinth and pistachia in molecules rather than words, we realize the supply chains ran across deserts and seas, international long before the term had currency, operated by clerks who knew that a formula is only as strong as its ingredients. The globality of ancient chemistry raises the question of shared traditions and exchanged secrets, of what Egypt learned and what it taught in return. At Saqqara's step pyramid, restorations reveal the sophistication of early stone ceilings that emulate wood, stone learning carpentry in a lesson that allowed long corridors to breathe and bear loads without collapsing, a quiet dance of tension and compression translated into permanence. The shapes are not mere imitation. They are adaptation, a proof that ideas carry across materials when artisans understand underlying forces. And this transfer hints at the mental toolkits within workshops that we rarely acknowledge. If training included thinking in structures rather than in single stones, then the capacity for generalization was itself part of the curriculum. And generalization is the seed of theory. Perfume resurrected from an ancient workshop near Mendes fills modern labs with a scent described in texts but long lost to air. Its reconstructed bouquet acting as a time portal that carries with it evidence of solvent control, extraction, and storage. In smell, we encounter a vector of memory that priests surely used to fix ritual into the nervous system, exploiting the brain's fidelity to fragrance to make ceremony unforgettable and therefore effective. The ability to pulse scent on cue makes a temple into a theater of physiology, and theaters can be engineered to privilege those who hold the timing. Some argue that the truly forbiddance in ancient Egypt was never a gadget, but an approach. The insistence on coupling observation with significance until the world answered in a stable way, and then guarding the coupling to prevent misuse, trivialization, or dilution. The priesthood's monopoly over calendars, embalming, pigment, and performance was not a conspiracy so much as policy. And policies cast long shadows when they are justified by success. If the shadow still falls across our attempts to reconstruct their sciences, it is because parts of the pattern were the people themselves, their training and context, which are the hardest things to exhume. Even now, excavations turn up workshops, with tools arrayed as if the craftsman had stepped out only for a moment, and the residue of a process sits on a bench waiting for the next stir, reminding us that answers may still be sleeping within arm's reach of the open air. A narrow room with a blocked door, a buried cache of scrolls, a sealed jar with a fragrance trapped since the reign of a king whose name we can still pronounce. Any of these could reset what we presume to know. In that expectancy, the old balance between rite and recipe, between symbol and measurement, between seen and orchestrated, holds its breath, inviting you to keep listening. Before you drift into sleep, remember mystery is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.